Welcome to Identified.
I think that the home and comfort that I feel in movement, I'm sure relates to how my ancestors moved. I feel like, I think for a long time, for many generations, one place was never home. And that's how it feels, just really natural to me. And that's just what home feels like to me. For now, I see that in my mom. I saw that in my grandma too, and both sides actually. I've tried being at home for a long time, but the best parts of me don't quite come out yet, you know?
Yeah, right.
So, maybe later on, but I love touring and I love meeting people and I love getting to be in relationship with different lands and those people. And for me, that's like my college education. That's how I learn the best.
Hello, I'm Nabil Ayers, author, music executive, and host of Identified, the podcast that delves deep into the complex world of family and identity. In this episode, my guest is Fabi Reyna, the founder of She Shreds Media and the musician who performs as Reyna Tropical. This episode will be especially interesting for those of you who have read my memoir, My Life in the Sunshine, because as you will hear, Fabi and I have many experiences in common. Growing up the only child of a single mother, finally meeting our fathers later in life, and eventually learning about distant siblings. Fabi and I sat down in Austin, Texas, on the tail end of South by Southwest, where we discussed her experience growing up in Mexico, phone calls with her imprisoned father, and how her work as an artist is inspired by a desire to further amplify the voices of women and non-gender conforming people. Here's my conversation with Fabi Reyna. Maybe we can start with your mother, who seems like a pretty important figure in your life.
Yeah. What do you want to know about that wild woman?
What's your first memory?
Well, this idea that I have of who she is a woman that I like to say like she's a wild woman. Like she's kind of like a wild wolf. And she raised me to be in movement. So that's sort of the texture that comes through in my mind when I think about her, whether that's a memory. It's kind of like this really fast-paced, moving image. I was raised in part in Cancun, where I was born, and we were always on the move. I was raised on buses. We would take 24-hour buses to go back up to the border. It was really like that. And I think that kind of speed and that momentum and that energy that she had and continues to have allowed her to break a lot of generational cycles that sort of prevented women in her life, in our family, from being who they wanted to be. So the first memory of my mom is kind of like a blurry image. And how I think about my mom now is sort of like the person who started the path for me to be in my fullest potential.
Amazing. Did you know grandparents, great-grandparents, anyone?
I was raised up until 6 years old with my grandma. And I wasn't raised with my dad. So I actually didn't get to meet my dad's side of the family, my grandma on his side, until I was 16. So I have not that many memories with either of them. I feel like I'm getting to know them a lot more now.
How so?
Because I think through the music that I make, especially through the music that I make, but I also think just through the work that I do, especially as someone who also wants to bring other women and non-binary and queer folks into their fullest potential or create the tools and the access for that, I feel like I get to be in conversation with my ancestors through the language of music. And they come through a lot. My grandpa does too. So I feel like the more internal that I go, and the more research that I do internally through writing, through singing and dancing and movement, I get to learn a lot more about where they come from and who they were and sort of get to like experience that with them.
Are there musicians in that ancestry that you know of?
My grandma on my dad's side
Okay.
was a singer-songwriter, guitar player. And when I met his side of the family, my aunt had like a tape of her music.
Wow.
It was really cool to hear.
Do you have it? Did you record it, or do you?
I have it somewhere, and I haven't listened to it in a long time, but yeah, I didn't grow up with musicians. I didn't grow up with music being like anything that was practiced or studied or talked about. So it was really cool to know that on that side, there's a history.
Yeah.
You know?
How did music start for you?
I think my mom would say that when I was like in first grade and there was like kind of music class in elementary school, where they were giving us like recorder, like, you know, that like recorder.
Flute thing,
yeah, the flute thing. And that's kind of like, that was the focus. But then to accompany the recorder, the teacher would play guitar.
Oh, cool.
And I kind of went up to him and was like, I want to play that instrument.
That looks more fun.
Yeah. And by the time I was 9, my mom is a single mom and worked like 4 jobs, kind of just put me in any extracurricular activities that she could. And eventually, after many sports, we got into music's camp. And that's where it all took off.
And it's always been guitar.
Actually started on drums.
Oh.
Yeah.
They say once you can play drums, you can play anything.
I believe that.
I'm a drummer, that's why.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Truly. Once you can like, you know, get your body to be in unison, but then also to be like having different conversations.
The independent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know a thing or two about that.
Cool. So on your father's side, I'm curious, and we have a lot in common. I didn't realize how much, but the sort of, I mean, I wasn't moving around in the same way you were, with literally on buses and crossing borders, but we moved a lot when I was a kid. Single mother, only child, your only child as well. And my mother just worked really hard to support us and support me, and like really sort of nurtured my interest in music and whatever I was doing. So what did you know about your father in those years it sounds like you met him later, but not when you were a kid? Yeah.
I met him later. Let's see, not that much. I didn't know that much. I knew that it's kind of interesting, you know, it's interesting to not know that much about someone, like especially your dad, and then kind of like you see who you become, and then being like, oh, that's where I get that from, you know. That's like where I could go. And he was in prison for like 20 plus years, and I actually met him like the day that he got out, which was really interesting.
How old were you?
16.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so I grew up like him calling from prison, but he didn't really want to talk to me. He was just kind of like in prison, maybe asking for money, or, you know, a big disconnect. So.
And you'd only met him on the phone, not in person?
He was there for my birth.
Oh.
And when I was in Cancun, him and my mom sort of raised me together for maybe like 4 years. And that's kind of like vaguely what I know, and not sure how the separation happened, but he couldn't cross the border. He had to stay in Mexico. And my mom at that point had citizenship. And so those are kind of the pieces that I know.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, it's definitely intense, and I feel like kind of common in maybe like Mexican.
Really?
And especially like cross-border identities. There's always some hardcore stuff in there. You know?
Yeah. So when you met him, I mean, this is interesting. This is not meant to be about me, but I keep identifying with a lot of the stuff you're saying. When I met my father really briefly a few times as a kid. Like we would run into him on the street in New York, and my mother would be like, "This is Nabil. Look how great he is." And that was it. That was the whole point. She wasn't trying to be like, "This is your father." It wasn't a big deal because it was never supposed to be. So I grew up just thinking like, that guy seems fine, whatever. He's not important. And I think mostly in a good way. And then in my 30s, I finally decided he's old enough, he's nearing 70. If I ever want to talk to him as an adult, I should probably try to do that. So figured out a way to get a hold of him, had this lunch with him. And it was really the first time, especially as an adult, that I actually sat with him. And it was really wild and amazing to just see, like, to sit across from him and see these mannerisms. And just the way he laughed, or the way he even just like moved to like get the check. And it was like, I do that. And it was so intense and interesting.
Totally.
Did you feel those kinds of things when you actually got to sit with your father for the first time at 16?
I mean, I look just like him. We're identical twins, basically.
Wow.
So that was really trippy, you know, just to like be able to see myself.
Yeah.
And I look like my mom, especially the older I get, but I look like him. What's the most interesting to me is that I learned later through crazy stories that I had two brothers on his side.
We have a lot in common.
Yeah. And I don't know, Reyna Tropical is all about the ocean. It's about like being with the ocean, tropical, just feeling the tropical in your body, tropical diaspora. And, you know, the Caribbean Sea is like the land that I was born on. My body, I feel like, continues to move towards. Mm-hmm. My two brothers, who I met separately, the first one grew up with my dad. He's younger than me. And he's from Acapulco, another coast in Guerrero. Mm-hmm. That's where he was born, that's where he was raised. And he's now living and working in Baja Sur. So that's that brother. And then 2 years ago, really random Instagram message connected me to this other brother that like...
I'm only laughing because... yes.
That like no one knew about. But it turned out that he was living in Cancun and he was working at the airport, the same job that my dad was working. And the taxi driver was like, "You look just like this man I used to work with 30 years ago." And he was like, "Let me show you a photo." And then my brother, who like couldn't like figure out my dad's last name or the spelling, was like, "That's my dad." Finally figured out the last name and he found me. And, you know, he's in Cancun. And I just think it's so interesting how we're all so obsessed with the ocean, you know? Like, those two brothers don't even know about each other yet.
Wow.
You know? And, like, they're doing the same jobs on separate coasts.
So you know both of them, but they don't know each other. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I haven't quite broken the news to, you know, I haven't done the whole work yet.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy and thought and time to, I'm in the same position.
Right. I'm not ready for that energy.
Yeah.
So that to me is like the most interesting, that clearly through my dad, we have this obsession and this connection with the ocean. Maybe my dad, but also whatever lineage he comes from. Mm-hmm. You know, so to me, it's like, yeah, I look like my dad and I know I have the tendencies of my dad, although I try really hard not to practice them. And more, the beauty of it, I think, is like I'm connected with that lineage through my love for the water.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, long story.
No, it's a great story. So do you have a relationship with your father now?
No, I don't. I've gotten to the point long ago. I grew up with like a lot of anger because, you know, he didn't really try to connect with me. But I got to the point where like I kind of realized once I got to meet him a couple of times that those things that live in him are really present in me, and I'm good having distance from that relationship. He's not someone that I care to be in a relationship with.
I'm curious how your mother handled you meeting your father when you were 16.
Well, she was there.
Must have been a lot for her, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder too. She was there, and there was a time where we were all like eating dinner together, and it was interesting.
Okay.
You know, like, I think she was, from like how I read her, what I remember reading her body, I think she was more worried about how I was feeling, you know?
Of course.
And so I feel like for her, it wasn't necessarily like, oh, I'm seeing this person again. It was mostly like, oh God, like full attention on how I was doing, right? Mm-hmm. And then I was worried about how she was feeling.
Because you have her genes too.
Right. Yeah. And I'm like, well, how are you feeling? This must be so weird. And then the whole thing was just like so weird, you know? So it's a trip.
Yeah. I'm curious, as someone who's toured a lot, and you obviously are a touring musician.
Yeah.
And this may be a stretch, but I've always been curious of people who, because it sounds like you moved around a lot as a kid. You said you were always in motion. Does that tie into your love or hate of touring as a musician in your adult life?
I think that the home and comfort that I feel in movement, I'm sure relates to how my ancestors moved. I feel like, I think for a long time, for many generations, one place was never home. And that's how it feels, just really natural to me. And that's just what home feels like to me. For now, I see that in my mom. I saw that in my grandma too. And both sides, actually. I've tried being at home for a long time, but the best parts of me don't quite come out yet, you know?
Yet, right.
So, maybe later on. But I love touring, and I love meeting people, and I love getting to be in relationship with different lands and those people. And for me, that's like my college education. That's how I learn the best.
It is an incredible exercise in sort of socialization and everything, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I never went to college, and I've always been really bad in school structures. Like I said, this is like my form of education.
Right. But what about She Shreds? I mean, you
Yeah.
never went to college, but you have this incredible magazine.
Yeah, totally.
You showed up on time. You're super, I mean, like everything about you is not
Right.
like I didn't go to college. It's really.
It's true. I don't know how that happened. I can't. And again, I think it's one of those things that what I feel like I'm really good at is like transforming energy. And She Shreds came from this feeling of anger, again, something that I've lived with for a long time. And I think also that I inherited anger from all the women in my family, my mom's side. I was raised by my grandma and my mom and my aunt. I feel their anger, I feel the anger from my great grandmas. And so that is a feeling that I know well, and I know how to work with it, and I know how to move it to create really big shifting things like She Shreds, like Reyna Tropical, and distribute it to become something creative and something that, can also, change the world essentially.
What is family to you?
Well, I have a lot of chosen family, and I think as a queer person, that's something that we're gifted, is like our ability to have maybe be often sort of abandoned by our families, and then take that and have chosen family in a massive way globally, So for me, family is like loyalty and acceptance and challenge, and, it's growing together.
Yeah.
So it's the commitment to growing together. And I think that can look in so many ways. I've never experienced like the traditional aspect of family. As being someone who's Mexican, so prideful of tradition, I never really experienced any tradition. And I think too that has to do with not having a relationship with like a father figure. My grandpa also died like when my mom was 13. So it's always been women. Mm-hmm. And I think not only are you severed like from land, but then women, you're severed culturally because so much of the culture is funneled through men, as Mexican at least. So yeah, it's really, for me, I feel like it's always been about how do I create my own culture? How do I create my own family? How do I create my own space? Everything is about creating something new. So yeah, I always find family that is also about that.
Thanks for tuning in. Please consider subscribing to Identified wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And be sure to check out Identified on YouTube and identifiedpod.com, where you can watch videos from our interviews. Our executive producer is Kieron Banerji, and the show is produced by Palm Tree Island. The music for Identified is by Noella and Patricia Brennan. I'm Nabil Ayers. Thanks for tuning in.